That's on education. Passion to gain Yamna Chasa and similar rally barriers. The names are on the Janju Simbi and Yamlin Gunia Lange, Juvan Yamlin Chicken, Casa de Yeda on Jugim. So that passion you can Yamlin and so that Choto Cuba, the Yomo, Nimbo Choto Cuba, don't buy you to be shared it is. Design the Nigi, don't buy you to be shared to combine a delatin, Yomo was upon the Jeba. Pasha de Pantures, Chesadinizam, Yomo Nimbo Chodi, Tamil, nobody to be shared. Chesadinizam, Simki Rashin, Sang Simki, Sang di Machinas, Simki Rashin, the song was in the same Dohawa, Chamosigura, did some said, Simki Rashin, don't buy it to already Matobaina, and Yomoba, Bomber Tuba, and Yomoba Pantu Mares, Chesada Simki, Simki Rashin, don't buy ni Magomba Che and Shen. Kewakazi Tubine and Digi and Ansuke, Tarbata Tamjikimbe, Gobon Tovalia, Tovi, doing that to 2 mares, Maduba and that, ya, Tarbi Tamjikimbe, Gobon Tovalia, Basic, Pai, Union Pai, Chagores, Dina, don't want you to be shared at Gomores, down to Passion Jubi Nane, that don't want you to be shared up the Yomo, Nimbo, Wiki. Good
evening. Last week, we concluded the subsection within this 5th chapter, presenting how virtue depends on the mind. And this was presented through showing how training in the 6 perfections depends on the mind. So those beings who are actually engaging in the 6 perfections, the Bodhisattvas, we saw in the final verse we looked at last week that it's imperative that they cultivate the wisdom realizing emptiness in order to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds and stains and arise as a Buddha. And in the verse, Shantideva described emptiness as being the secret of the mind. In other words, that the mind lacks natural existence. The mind doesn't exist by way of its own nature or essence, but is empty of existing in this way. So this has to be known, has to be realized. Otherwise, the Bodhisattva, no matter how much merit they accumulate, will not be able to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds, and thereby will be greatly impeded in their expression of virtuous activities to help others. So therefore, the Bodhisattva needs to train their mind in the various trainings of bodhicitta and the method side, as well as wisdom, in order to arise as a Buddha, a perfected being who can be of great benefit to all.
Semrashi to Tomba di Misha Congo, the Simki Santi, Machina, said Jazada, so Tomba the Chi, Susoting, Tomba Togo, or Congo, so Nanga Simki, Susuki, some Semti, Tomba Rashi to be Tomba, Tele Jabati, Tomba Torchine, the Simki Rashi, Semrashi, Matuba, the Misha, and the Congo. Sanki Yamlen Zo, Chevala, Tomba Yokume, so did that, so Simki Tendo, Misha, Simki Rashing to be Tomba de me, all those in
When cultivating the wisdom that realizes emptiness, one is cultivating the wisdom that understands how all phenomena actually exist. So one will look at a wide variety of all phenomena, seeing how they exist. So they are in the external world, or in the material world rather. So all forms of form. So our body and everything external to that. There are a wide number of objects that can be investigated to see how they exist in reality. But what's of more importance is to look at the inner object of our mind and come to recognize that our mind is not established by way of its own nature or characteristics or essence, but is rather empty of existing in this way, empty of existing in the way that it appears. So therefore, realizing the emptiness of the mind is of crucial importance. It's imperative to realize the emptiness of one's own mind. And again, to emphasize, it's imperative to realize the emptiness of one's own mind in order to become a Buddha. We're continuing in the text now, the new sub-outline in the 18th verse. Since it is like that, this mind of mine, I shall hold it well and safeguard it properly. Apart from the yogic discipline of guarding my mind, what use are the many other yogic practices?
And
So the verse starts with, since it is like that. So this then refers to what has just been covered, which is that first we looked at how faults depend on the mind. Thereafter we looked at how good qualities depend on the mind. So having now come to recognize that both the abandonment of faults refers to transforming one's mind and the accumulation of merit refers to transforming one's mind. This is recognized now to be of great importance.
dagi semdi sa lekson lepar songa cha da dagi sosoranga semdi anda semdi songures dagi semdi lekson sida dagi semdi songure songa di da jembigi jembigi tienje and karol songures semdi nyomo bichoso dro majuwa che semki choso jembi yaho songche na songure sa chi songore sa dagi semdi ni lepar song sa di.
First line then, since it is that through both the accumulation of merit and the purification of non-virtue depends on this mind of mine. Now the second line, I shall hold it well and safeguard it properly. This then refers to, I will rely on mindfulness and vigilance. I will take care of my mind, ensuring it stays on the side of virtue and thereby accumulates merit and does not engage in, or follow afflictions and thereby accumulate non-virtue. So I will safeguard my mind, holding it well with mindfulness and vigilance.
lebar sung se de songar cha se de ne xixing ye semdi migi cho ka nyomo cho so zhou duye mindu semi ba ji xixing ba jene da du xin nga de lunga ge jue ba da de ne ge cha sa de migi cho so zhou duye mindu du xin ne xixing ye jie jie da jie jie de ne du xin ne song gu semdi ya migi cho so ma da ge nyomo cho so ma da wa song gu re se lebar songar cha sa lekson se de jembigi jemba tianji sim gyu chu de jian de lekson je da lebar song ja se de ne xixin gi sim de mi gyu chu ka nyom bu chu zhou duye min du sim gi ba jie da wa jie ne song gu le se tang bo de jemba de ge ji lekson se de sim yu jian jembi sim de gyu chu zu jing gu le lekson se de ni ba lebar song se de da xixin gi and same day migi chu nyomo chu so zhou duye min de jie ba jie de song gu le se da gan de zhen xi xi song gu le.
The first line then leads on from what has been looked at in the previous section, which is that I need to ensure our mind stays on the side of virtue so that I accumulate merit and not on the side of non-virtue, which means I would accumulate non-virtue, the causes for suffering. And how to do so is presented in the second line. I shall hold it well. So this means I will use mindfulness I'll hold my mind with the attention of mindfulness as well as safeguarding it properly. That refers to vigilance. So one will both hold one's mind well and safeguard it properly. One will both use mindfulness and vigilance. In this way, always being aware of our physical behavior and our speech and the motivating intent behind that, watching the mind, ensuring that it stays virtuous.
주비야 당 개와 주비야 뭐 공도 폐야 개와 디게다 아니 녀모바 야미 녀모바 디게 방야 쳐서 셈러라래 바이나 랑게 셈디하고 숨고리 스티간데 숨고리 그리고 숨고리스네 다 덴비게 셈데 개와 바 자진 녀진 아니 바 녀모바 저기야래 바갓 개위 초를 끼죠 셈 개와 장야 삼주 개와 덴베지 데네 시신기 아니 셈디 미게 쳐서 두고디 미게 끼고 두에 끼게 삼다 도시 신신이 따바치 제바치 안도시네 하고요도 미게 쳐 두고요 바 하고나 양 덴베게 셈네 바 진주 도시네 도 진거래 제자다 도 된다라 아주 셈디 아니 야고지 송고래 셈송아리 베지치오 전시신 된제 셈디 베지치는 송고래 에서다네
to not only accumulate virtue, but to accumulate ever more virtue, one needs to take good care of our mind. And how to do so? It's through relying on mindfulness and vigilance. In using mindfulness and vigilance to ensure our mind is not dominated by the afflictions, but rather remains bound to virtue. So one utilizes vigilance to watch the mind, standing in the background, keeping an eye on things, and utilizing mindfulness in two ways. Utilizing mindfulness to hold the mind to virtue. So, in other words, through recalling virtue all the time. And when vigilance notices that mindfulness has lost its virtuous object, in other words, the mind has gone to the afflictions. When vigilance notices that, immediately mindfulness will recall the faults of the afflictions and recall the virtuous object, and one's mind will once again be dominated by virtuous factors and no longer by the afflictions. This then is how to guard the mind.
number dele su gyuje sangbi chosu gyuwa dele dushuk sachi la gore dushuk lamna lunga yusmi jeba ngambi chode su gyurje sangbi chosu gyuwa 심지 야be chosu gyuwa dele dushuk se gore lunga yinga jeba ngamba dige yabu meba dige su yabu su gyuwa dele ane de jikaso dise gore dushuk sachi dene chi ko gore
Third and fourth lines, apart from the yogic discipline of guarding my mind, what use are the many other yogic practices? So this uncommon term I've translated as both yogic discipline and yogic practice. In this context, this Tibetan term means the practices or the discipline by which one turns one's body, speech, and mind from non-virtue to virtue. So in this context, there's one Tibetan term translated as yogic practices and yogic discipline refer to the practices or disciplines by which one turns one's body, speech, and mind from non-virtue to virtue.
최고 수요제 안 되네 장아 저기 rabjung미 되게 상예 좀된 되게 두슈 진바서 상예 좀된 데 가르 난 거스네 고잡 매 가소래 kuya chugu suya dang, luigi kimda kimi peke bangja rabdu chungwa zang, di nashi ngan sugi luigi gyurshe, nyama kola chayo bada kimbe dulo di gyurshe rabchungi chalu zimba za luigi chalu tuyu. Ngan sanye chumne digi garan nangora sene semdi ane kaso shenla nyoba micheba shenla penbi samba dushin chukwe zang anzu ine shenla nyoba chigime surum sunya dang ane chigi o jimbe nyamne chaya dang suebe nyamne chaya nyamne liya zunba di chisa sangye chumne digi gares nawa nashin semki chigi nyamne nata dini nawa da ching anzu ge semdi nyema nga semdi gyurche sangye chumne digi nashin che komja samna dada na dus chaya liya lagu orwa ane nga zo dulo dang dora ki cholam dige na sangye chumne dige kadis na wana di na shin ji yuang tuye ga zo bezo chi ji nangu ji go ra chisa sangye chumne dige dushu zimba se deni ki dushu chisa dushu se di sangye chumne dige nyama lunga yusun ye choba ngamba le gyurche lunga su chasa sangbo kyang ya bashi gyur wa chisa de dushu di na shin gan zo ne dus che ba enza da dushu zimba se sangye ge da rabchung dushu zimba di na shin yang ji kimbi ge ngakwe duju tsimpa yang jimi yang sanga nyamne je ne ane jigi ngakwe bene chegwe dushin guen je yang jig che dulo se la chegwe sen dulo se da zui rabju dige ngakwa di yang dulo ha guen lo nga zui ne rabju chegwe konggo lo konzo yang jig gwe ga ba dan ko jig je chelu shanda ro wa ba sen konzo ge de message lo sunggu ma ro wa 제상 앞에 첼룩 진제 단 상하게 냠는 시간소 되는게 라미 땡셔바 라마 이담 가서 코로나 중에 냠는 제바 나주 두시네 냠는 제 로기 제바선다 두슈 심바서 상하이 두슈 심바 제선다 rabjung 두슈 심바다 상하이 두슈 심바서 제가 두슈 세데 제바 류하게 제바 남바들에 파 교체 상비에 초소 교 교회들이 두슈제 이 되는게 냠는 나와들라 단 남교가 두슈 심바서 그걸 받아 luki dushu, ngaki dushu, tene iki dushu saya chagurwa.
Previous segment, as the translator missed out the term conduct or behavior. So this term, yogic discipline or yogic practices, specifically refers to conduct of the body, speech, and mind. So now to continue with Geshe has just said, again, talking about the meaning of this term, because it's quite uncommon and it's not translated in any one way. So to give further illustration, there is yogic discipline or yogic practices of the ordained and the non-ordained. So first, the ordained follow the behavior of the yogic practices of Buddha Shakyamuni, who turned away from the life of a householder and ordained, cut his hair, donned simple robes or simple clothing, and then entered into various meditative trainings. Similarly, a conduct of the Buddhas that both ordained and non-ordained follow will be cultivating the Buddha's yogic discipline of the determination not to bring any harm. So that's the training in ethical restraint, as well as the Buddha's yogic disciplines or yogic practices of training to bring benefit to others, such as through generosity and patience. So these are examples of training our mind and acting under the influence of that training with our speech and our physical conduct, following the Buddha's example of his yogic disciplines. And for the ordained, they would follow the example of the Buddha's yogic discipline and dress in a particular way, wearing robes similar to what the Buddha wore. All of these yogic disciplines are moving the conduct of the body, speech, and mind towards the side of excellence. And for those who are not ordained, we've already spoken about some of the trainings such as ethics, generosity, and patience that are followed, but also so too in terms of dress code for those engaging in yogic practices. Then there'll be specific robes and a longer hair tied in a top knot that the non-ordained will follow when engaging in tantric practices, following the illustration of yogic practices of the Buddha. So these are illustrations of where one takes the behavior of the Buddha the behavior of his body, speech, and mind as our role model, our example, and we emulate that conduct, that behavior, by training our body, speech, and mind in those same yogic practices as he's done.
Dushu Simba se tenis ko Luyu Dushu Simba, Ngagi Dushu Simba, Ngagi Dushu, Luyu Dushu, Yiki Dushu Sade, Odu Sungorwa, Dinajimi, Danjig, Nangbo Mayimbi, Jig Shanda Chulu, Shandami, Jig in the Hindu Soba, the Nigi, Ankoranzuke, Lamigi, Jig Drumdagi, Shisonjin, Di Chone, Ajig Lunagi, Jeba Gushin, Ajin Yaman Chigoro, this way according to Dushu Simba Chagorwa, Dushu Simba, Zingorwa, Carson Koranzuki, that Jig.
Yogic conduct then is of three types, that of the body, the speech, and the mind. And it's not something exclusive to Buddhists. Non-Buddhist Hindu practitioners do this, where they will follow the yogic conduct of their teachers. So this is still alive in the world today and practiced by sadhus, where they follow the example of yogic conduct of their teachers in terms of their physical, verbal, and mental behavior.
Samsung Dushu Matopa said that Samsung Dushu single rage. The Samsung Dushu said, and the same said that the Dushu said, the same Yomo Chosopa. Yi Dushu said, the same day, same Nambi Chod Guja, Sambi Chod Guja de la same Dushu Sagrua, Lu Chiru Rabju in the Nima Kimbi Lu Chique that the Nikpa Gurja Rabju Gomba the Lu Guasa Chagurua. Dinaji that the same Dushu said that the same Dushu said that same day, Yombo Choso. 당봉하는 중이라 셈녀모 기고를 되셔 공정하게 여러분 디스파가 셈디 다 기회 철파 유엘이야 귤바디 디 귤신 유아디다 셈이 두식샤고로 봐 제선디 셈소야디 셈이 두주리스 제가 셈녀모 쳐서 좋아요 송제 셈 기회 철을 강장 다야디다 셈이 두주리스 제선디 셈송 두식세 디제디다 제가 계시모시 오래서다 니마도 and the Gachimore said, Namodu, Chegore said, Captain Zoda, Gewa, to get a similar rally by Yomo Bangba, and similar rally by Inza, Mahazu, same D, Pasung, Yomo, Choso Dried, Sung, Gewicho, Gugore, Dushu Chagore, such to Sumore. Same you do you see. She said, Luke, do you say, I think, I did same dulo, the Luke do you said. It's all that. Now I do you learn the million six of down, Juhura, Shigan, Dipa, Shache, and the same Kasana, Kish Tangushia, the Jumba Sheba, Tsuma Sheba, Jamba, Jambi, Sixsheba, the Nagi, too. And by the Gurcia, some which was you as a Nagi do you say, Chagua. That is the deal also. Samsung do you. Matoba, the same Samsung Dushu, that Yechimodiniam, Chehore, the Dicares and Anjuki, Yomo Chazan, Kasom, Neva Chazan, similar in the Yongo, Kivas and Chazan, similar in the Jupor, Chesa Jezada, Yomo Badigeda, Neve Chudi Bangchi, Kivichu the Juko, and that is similar in the Yonguza, Chesa same dida, Yomo Chos Matawaji, Kivichu Janya, Jehedida, in some diadida, same you Dushu, yes. That did Sungore, Dira Janares, Ikechimores, as Sungorada.
There are yogic practices of the body, the speech, and the mind. So an example of a yogic practice of the body would be when one ordains, one wears the robes of the ordained, and one leaves behind the life of a householder and then lives in accordance with the life of an ordained person. So in terms of physical conduct, then that would be the yogic conduct or the yogic practice of an ordained person. Then there is the yogic practice of speech, which would be to abandon speech that is speaking in a way that is harsh or being deceptive, telling lies, and rather to embrace the conduct that is of speaking in a way that is honest and straightforward. So that would be an illustration of yogic discipline of speech. But here, in this verse from Shantideva, it specifically refers to the yogic conduct of the mind, which comes down to turning the mind away from non-virtue. So in other words, ensuring the mind's not under the influence of the afflictions, and rather embracing virtue, ensuring that the mind stays wholesome and virtuous at all times. So this is the yogic practice here. And this yogic practice is accomplished by holding the mind well and safeguarding it properly. In this way, this yogic practice of the mind is accomplished.
Andonala Simsung Dujuk said the Ganesh Gurus and Sim Yomo should try the park, Sim Givi Chos Ganyan, Juadilla, that's Simsung Dujuk Chowra, D. That Dinyam Jawarias. That Madoba, the D Madoba, and Dujus Mambu Jisha said, Tenigi Sim D, and the Jig Namian Jingyomo Shoso Danje, and the Jig Jingazuki Jig Luki Dushu, Nagi Dushu Kasi Chevene, and the Jig. Tarba 탐지 김벽고 토투가 말에 제산 디니기 아니 제화요 말에 해서월다 마도 지시자세 셈지도 셈의 송고를 녀모버 초소라 송제 아니 지금 냠네 지월 마도 셈 마송바데 셈디 녀모버 초소 당제는 류기 두슈다 아기 두슈 이 제까지 제베네 아니 지금 녀모바를 코발을 줘투베요 말에 제산 디니기 두슈디게 제화요 말에서 망보 지시자 디네 망보 휴지 제화요 말에 해서월다.
This verse then is about the need, or the urgent need to engage in the yogic conduct of subduing and training our mind. In particular, what it comes down to is preventing the arisal of the afflictions, or at the very least ensuring that they do not dominate, and rather embrace virtuous ways of thinking. We see here in the fourth line, what use are the many other yogic practices? So what this refers to is, if one isn't holding one's mind well and safeguarding it properly, but rather letting it be distracted and influenced by the afflictions, then one may well be engaging in various yogic practices of body and speech. But if the mind is under the influence of the afflictions, if the mind is not being safeguarded, those various yogic practices of body and speech, they will not lead to the spiritual developments that we seek.
Yasa jige sem di nyomo bo choso sem tam nyanda yoya sosoge ane jige bo yoya sosoge ya jige denige yoya ge dondala ane jige sosoge denige samdang de na jige cham je de chen denige ya jige nga ma ta ya la so ba de bene ji yung go ba da je rab chung che lu je da dene nga pe che lu je dan jige jo je de yung go ba da 제산 대소 가선 셈디 뇨모버 쇼소 샤와다 되거래 제사다 랑기 튕견루야 담냐다 요야 차당 안능하게 되네 샤와서도 류데네 류기 두주다 지금 랍중에 실루 제베나 앞에 실루 제베네 얘네 링하게 실루데 지금 아사야라서 받아 제베네 제산 셈디 뇨모버 쇼소 땅사원자 지 메디 아니 디 개와 되신거데네 개와 지 타바 탐지 김이 톱투에 개와디 용국사교 말에 시사 되니자 제조네 셈 뇨모버 초소 땅제 되지 두주 쳔바이네 륜하게 두주 쳔바이네야 니샤라 판도 요요 말에스 시사디 고야요 말에스 델레 조다 셈디 파송제 셈디 뇨모버 초소 송바이나 되네 륜하게 주바디게 두주디게 야보요야 이 말에스 제 송거다.
What we're being warned of here is really greatly important, which is take care of your mind. Then your body and speech will be excellent. Don't put on a display. Don't try and look the part and not rather than train your mind. This will not turn out well. And there's real danger of this. For example, someone goes into retreat and doing perhaps a deity retreat where they're reciting lots of mantras. So they're engaging in yogic practice, and the yogic practice of being in retreat. So there's a physical yogic practice, or body yogic practice, And then there is the verbal, the speech yogic practice of reciting mantra. But their mind is dominated by 8 worldly concerns. Their mind is thinking, dominated by thoughts of my reputation, what others will be talking about me, how my career opportunities will open up in the future. Thinking like this, clearly the mind itself is not engaged in any yogic behavior. And therefore, instead of this Dharma activity of engaging in retreat and reciting mantra, leading to the afflictions being reduced in strength and the virtuous mind strengthening, the opposite is happening. Afflictions are growing. And virtue, therefore, is not being accumulated. So this person engaging in yogic deeds of body and speech is not achieving their potential, is not actually leading towards the progression towards enlightenment. But in fact, their afflictions are just getting stronger. So again, the meaning is, take care of your mind, and your body and speech will be good. But if you don't take care of your mind, then your body and speech may look good, but you will not be achieving what you desire.
That's easy to Nimbo de la database, Nyabata, similar in the Yungore, Nekawatia, similar in the Yungore, just not all same day, just the same day, that's Rangi, same day, and that Yomobo Chuso Matawaje, Givi Chosopa, Jambigi, Zinchinik, Jambigi, same day, Kawalia, Janga, some Cortua de Chores. And she's in and it's Yomo by you do mean the Jeba Cheche, Duchin, how going to Lamsan Tembe in Jepa, and Duchin, she sent that she knew to the same day, Kawatanya, do Gurtuyaki, Kawale Pajawores, the Besuchores. Is that the same Yomo Sugaji, same Kiwishu, you are the same Dushukte, that comes same Dushuktes, she's that same Dushdi, Pal Yapush Sona, and then Jigoma, the same day. Yomo chose Mason and Lungagi, Chike, Jebati Gurchik, Dushu Simbaina, Digi and Padashara Yomari, such as more.
And to summarize then this 18th verse, in the first line, since it is like that, this mind of mine, this refers to then what we've looked at before, that virtue depends on a mind. Non-virtue depends on a mind, or to express it differently, that both the accumulation of virtue depends on the mind, and the purification of non-virtue depends on the mind. So since it is like this, I shall hold it well and safeguard it properly, meaning I will rely on mindfulness to hold my mind well, and I'll safeguard it properly through vigilance. In this way, I'll ensure that my mind stays uninfluenced by the afflictions, but abides on virtue. And this is the supreme yogic conduct of the mind for me to engage in. When I compare this to other yogic conducts of body and speech that could be engaged in, they are of no importance if done with no importance when compared to the importance of the yogic conduct of the mind. If I take care of my mind, then my yogic conducts of body and speech will be excellent. If I don't, they'll just be superficial.
In
brief then, in one sentence, this verse emphasizes the need to take care of our mind.
And that in my Duskevar, that's the same to Sundan got a Sunguri and the knitting the Sunguri, she Sungura in ma. That is at the Citilla, Madame Drew, Nena, Jim de May Bachishin, Kiong and True Nebe Yang, Simji Mati Dato Sungs.
Now, Shantideva presents in a more expansive manner how to strive in guarding the mind, which is the general sub-outline we are in. When amidst a jostling, so the 19th verse, when amidst a jostling crowd that's been let loose, I am focused, attentive, and careful of a sore. Similarly, when amongst particularly unwholesome people, I should continuously protect my sensitive mental scars.
This is the same picture, Sunguri, that's Sundan Sunguri, that in my Sundan Sungur, what is that? Madame Drew, Chen in the acid, that Madame Drew, training as the modern draw said the Bene Zemo Zeda, Namian, Sim Namian, Zemo Ze, Betty buying Gemosha and buying dinner songs in use, but Benazuki, the Chigoro Chilo, the Mabu use, then the Zemo Zesa, songs in use, Namian Mabu use, Sim Bar Meva Jepat, Lucian Jetu Chesegi, near the Niki Della and modern Trivinis. Modern draw said, Denichko is a modern draw said, Zemota, energy, Sim Namia. And Namia, Namia, Swat, and the same Bame, Lucian, Jigueva, Deniki, Gemma, Shada, same that they had to start Maraji doing something to be Mongoyo such a Jiguevana, they and Madame Druid, Madame Drova such, Madame Druid, yes, I didn't see Madame Druid, yes, I didn't see like Madame Druid train in us, so the Madame Drova said, near the, yes, I did.
To look at a more expansive way in how to guard the mind, Shantideva presents a illustration when amidst a jostling crowd that's been let loose. So here one can perhaps, in our modern context, think of if you're watching, if you're at a sports stadium that's absolutely packed and they're watching a very vibrant game before them. The crowd may be swaying and moving, and there's a lot of activity in the crowd that you are a part of.
On that train in us, the church, the Ming Anzuli, a Gangbaina, the Lawaina, and Maros, Nazar, Yuding Chivana, Nazar Yuvaji, Denigi, Mimambo, Sangas, and Zemot, Beji, Bame, Dusin, Yuding, Mimambo, Kilpa, Devaina, and then on the Devanada. Suba Labana Gambal, Mayuki, Nazi, and the Danish Devana, so that Madame Trivigi, Drovigi, Chena, the Chess and the Gidua, the US did never and the Nena, and the Garcigas and Anna, Jim de May Bartition, Penepes, Sosuki, Madilia, Chandaga, 2 years and best subs of Shiu, Jim des and best subs of Jeje, Madi, Sosu, Madilia, Barchi, Sungor was tell a 2 by so by the too much subsection Sungor was, but they needed the poor parcel you can, me parcel you can, same as the time you tell ya, Davia 2 years, Yangashimu sugar, but the neighbor society subs of Shiuch in the Sungor, the Niki, then the society with Madi, the bed did too much over the subs of Shiuch and Sungor was and the bed of Sungor, Jim de May Barchishins.
The second line, when a misadjusting crowd has been let loose, I am focused, attentive, and careful of a sore. So imagine you're in this sports stadium, you're watching a sports match, and the crowd are excited and they're moving with their excitement. No matter how exciting the endeavors on the sporting field are, you'll be watching that, but you'll also be very aware of the movements of your body. And you'll be very aware of the movements of this jostling crowd around you. You'll be attentive and focused to protect your body. And this is the case if it's just a sensitive sore, nothing more than that, let alone if you had gone to the sports match with a gaping wound. Even with something small, like a sensitive sore, you'll be attentive and focused and careful of your physical behavior, as well as all that activity around you, while still watching the excitement on the field of sports.
On the Nigi, the Madilia, 2 years, Kin Mangu, Chubanza, that the Nigi, and subs of Chu in the Sungur was, Shins, that the Nan Shins or Gyoang Andres, Gyoang and Twin, Navy, young, Simi Mati Sung, to the Chisan Anzo Garrison, Gyoang and Betrin and Navy, so Gyoang and Bassedi. The child, about Condro, you about Nadia, you about Numo, Chitine, King of the Yudu, but the child, Condro, Nadia, and the Nigi, and the chick. You by Zan, Digi, and the Six of Tandem Use, Tamaragi, Tangan Yomo, but the Gisho, the G, Tangan the dinner, the Nigi, the Chisos Nala, Dudu, or was and Gyo Embassy, Gyo Embassy, the same. Marunwa, Nyomo, Deja, Condor, Naja, Denigi, Train Momba, Denis Nang to Snedio, yes. Then near by Zadang on the culture or Labna, 당한서 샘데 미게와다 콘도게다 되셔게다 베 타니부 쇼르와다 그래서는 디나데 근데지 현이 측습셰바다 디네 현이 지금 콘로라 집에네 당한서 콘로라 쳐줘래 안 현이 아직 녀모비게 차비게 지금 삼로디게 된 안줄이 차바게 냥아 안가게 냥아 쇼지어들어와다 디네 자당한서 디니기 아줄이 되죠 콘로 녀모에서 할 수 있는 녀모에 쳐서 유쳐줘 예되래 여바인자 디기 샘디 베지 다도 송고리에서 샘기 마디 세데 샘기 대시 수고 만하싱아서 샘 마세데 샘디 녀모에 쳐 로초초랑 샘디 디네자 샘디 아니 전시진 된지 녀모에 쳐서 좀 맞춰봐지 송고리에서 대야 살지마이바 차이니마이바 뒤다도 기디네 송고리에서 다도 송 샘디 마디 다도 송
The first two lines then in the 19th verse, Shantideva presents this illustration. And the meaning of this is that even when one is in a situation where there's a lot going on, and it's such as this, where there's a lot going on about you, you still can remain focused, attentive, and careful. So people will have experience of doing this. So therefore, it is not something beyond our capacity. We need to do this in the time of real danger, and that is presented in the final two lines. Similarly, when amongst particularly unwholesome people, so this refers to those who easily, readily express their afflictions such as anger, attachment, pride, etc. So when amongst such people, I should continuously protect my sensitive mental scars. That then refers to be on guard against the arisal of our own afflictions. Because when you're with people who are expressing their own desires, it's very easy for our own attachment to arise. Or if they're expressing their anger, then for us it's very easy for anger either to arise towards the person they're talking about or towards them if they're angry at us. Or if they're expressing pride, it's very easy for our pride to arise and stand up for ourselves. So here, we need to be careful. These are the situations of grave danger. And we need to rely on mindfulness and vigilance to take care of our mind in these situations of great danger. And we should do so continuously. In other words, in all circumstances where there is danger, we should rely on mindfulness and vigilance.
Chöle yöbene gangbala bada maroj mebene andiwa ba bu chunju de gangbu ga dozi dang gangba ja zhobene shira na syo mara mayune de de tu san shu na yong ro din na xin a semdi sin ma shi de nga zo semdi nyo mo be ge chö chö yu chö cha de re wa de min sem nyamle na je ya do bo ko ro de du ge jen sem ba ne de din din gi semdi lamsa nyo mo chö 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 yo ma ro wa je san semdi ma shi de ham de ma ji le 독스는 낮춰줘요 바나지 만주 셈들이야 남산 요모배 쳐서 저쳐줘 인자 생기 마세디 콜라고에 대도 좀 새로 들려.
The illustration of the 19th verse, I think, is really quite apt and something easy to relate to. We know that if we have a sensitive sore, just touching it, and immediately there's a physical reaction and a mental reaction because it's painful. And then when we have to place ourselves in a situation where we are in danger of the sore being stimulated, we are very careful, we are attentive, and we are cautious. This is the approach that we should take to our mind. Recognize that in the same way as we merely touch a sore, or even perhaps cold air comes on it, and that could be enough to hurt it. We need to be aware of how easily our afflictions arise. It takes so little for attachment to anger, pride, or any of the others to arise. So we need to be on guard, protect our mind well with mindfulness and vigilance.
어디니게 심승에 대한 지대 대시 지바로 전시신 된지 송고고로 지자 샘디 아주 야 에네 아주 도시네 심미식이 특수지 수셰베나 lamsa semdilia chik pa nyoba control language minto some chik ten shishing pa da dinige shishing pa jenige control kisara somdi lamsa tembi oda control kin tingmar pa control king me a pa len ya nyobe len chik me sembi samda du ko sebo komyongurwa sebo komo jesadi semdida control ki edil sungorwa chen nyoba ki nyobe samba de sungorwa jesa chik me sembi samda de tempati pa sungye ndelya an chik jone pa denishebla pa chike pembige pa nyobe len pa sabdelia pembe len ya samda be ne de gewa semne gewe cho songwa an dinige dinha she dangan jugim 야 지게 콘트기에 유를 써야 돼. 되네 멤버게 차바기에 유를 되네 지유의 체험도 남사 안는 시신기 다 차바기 유 샘내야 차바기서를 계서 말해 샘비게 도시는 시신이 봐 따요. 되네 남사 어디 차바기는 지금 말해 샘비 잼베 봐 진지야 남사 어디 때 진지 차바 절마다 써야 돼. 잼베 도시는 제자데 제자 되네기 당한도 지 부로 교어도 맞이야 가요로 어디나지 볼리로 유용반데 볼리 투마지 가요로 어디나지 가르치 되니기 여샤게기 kiến 레도 시신이 하고 제 템페파 디 여샤게 맞고 지야다 콘트게기 kiến 레도 되니고 콘트게 맞고 잼베 진지야 안도신 세보 검토야 어디니 디나시 나지양 동외 셈바 갑리야 세나 게르도 대파가지 동외 셈바기야 되니 다양지 전주 냠내지에 레로지다 남산 어디 레로레 기도스베 하고 같이 시진을 하고 같이 남산 템비 어디 레로긴 지금 말했으면 내 개월이야다 전주기 셈들 잠바스 잼비기 전주기 주바나 도시는送야돼 도시는 송고래에서 전 시진이 다 셈기도 다도 송세 기디네 되네시 송고르디네 야 차지 송이 도시 송고 이야기 주고로 와서 올라
This training then is really something to take to heart, because all too often we are in circumstances where we don't recognize the very real danger that we are in. And this is because we're not really on guard, not really protecting our mind. If we have trained well, recognize what are the triggers for our afflictions and what kind of circumstances I'm likely to find myself in today, then we've prepared well. Then we can be sure that if we encounter someone who perhaps speaks to us in an abusive manner, or maybe they talk down to us, instead of responding in the usual way, which would be for pride to arise and anger to arise and respond in kind, and later brag to others about how we put them in their place, rather, we can rely on our training, and we can respond with love and compassion and wisdom. In other words, we respond through our training in patience. This then leads to not only the avoidance of accumulating non-virtue, but actually the strengthening of our minds of virtue and the accumulation of virtue. Or even more common than encountering someone who speaks to us in an unkind manner is being in situations where our affliction of attachment arises, because this attachment arises so easily. And it is a mind that is one of the primary obstacles to our development of our spiritual goals. So we should become very aware of the faults of attachment. And then, by relying on vigilance, as soon as we see attachment arising, mindfulness reminds us of its many faults. And thereby, we can apply an antidote, remind ourselves that whatever it is that we desire, it only serves this mind of attachment to impede our spiritual development, and thereby turn away from attachment and embrace virtue again. And to do so, we should have the vigilance, the attention and care of someone whose body is very sensitive. Because a body that's very sensitive, but is needing to move through a jostling crowd, will take great care of their movements and be very mindful of the movements of those around them. This is how we should be with our mind, when we're with others and when we're alone. And not just against the afflictions we often reference, such as attachment and anger, but also those such as laziness. If we've set our heart on developing a spiritual goal, whether it's accumulating the causes for excellent rebirth or anything above that, we should be aware that laziness, being drawn to worldly affairs, this serves only to consume our time and strengthen our afflictions. Rather, by using vigilance to recognize the arisal of laziness, use mindfulness then to see its faults and to generate joyous perseverance, turning our mind back to virtue and taking intentional delight in doing so, and thereby persevering in our accumulation of virtue. So what's been described here is the process by which we seek to strengthen our habituation to mindfulness and vigilance, and through them to virtue, and weaken our habituation to be having vigilance and mindfulness absent, and thereby our habituation to the afflictions.
Dine da dondala ang zhe sem song dang kan de song gu re se na ma ru yu hin chi de bu mi sang ha sing de ne ge zema zhe ge sang ha sing yue se yu de ne ba de ma di pa chi sab sab xiu yin song guo ru was ni na xi nga zhe se nga zhe ga wa de yo se na nga zhe ge da de ne ge an de jin yo mo ba ye chue chue de ji de ne ge ge mong bu yue se na le ya on du ste de yo re de ne zang ha zhe sem di na yo mo bu chou zhuo chou chou cha de ge yue ji de ne zang sem di对大多真巴的细心点解，这个控制给那那么上控制把业嘛就准备进水包公面当的那个这个前列女士些个健身类的那个细心也好我就准备那么上那边进这个嘛的准备也送啊要把送给先把咱们当一对的出什么送也加用了这个的那什么大呀然后这个你呀这个denegi mi luang boda denegi chi le yong de ka ba den chi ya de sen na ki de sen rang le na da xian gi de ba le ya sen na gi de denegi jian xi ji ha ho lam sang ki de de sen na gi de ma de sen na gi yo ba de ji da sen na ji ge ma su su ge ji gang jian li ya dong tu ji wo le sen be dong ye sen ba zhang de denegi jian de ko du xin de sem sun xia de sen na sun ya de la dong ye sen ba zhang dong ye sen ba jian xi ji ji谢心也接吧加好过真别真的东西什么公呀的呢谢心也接吧真的真别个好过真别个呀你送也什么公呀的呢的那个谢心接吧真的先这个真别真就什么公呀那这联络给们谢心也好过的接吧这谢心呀的那好过真别个呀专注的把真呀我都是呢什么送过来是什么送他的都是也是很多他的送多啊
Another way that we can use this analogy is if you imagine that you are in a situation of a jostling crowd, or maybe you have a child who's playing a sporting game, but you know they have an injury, but they're still playing. You'll be very aware of how they are moving as well as everyone else, very aware that they have a wound, that they have an injury, and they need to be careful. So you'll be particularly focused, attentive, and careful of them. So too, this is how we should be of our mind. In all circumstances, especially those where we have identified that our mind is quite likely to overreact, to arise in the afflictions, whether it's attachment or jealousy or pride or anger or laziness too through attachment. We need to be on particular guard, and we do so by relying on vigilance and mindfulness. So when we recognize an affliction arising, we can utilize any of our training, for example, that of ethical restraint, recognizing that the afflictions are what lead to me engaging in ways that will harm myself and possibly others. Therefore, I must refrain from the afflictions. I have to weaken my habituation and never justify them. I need to weaken my habituation and rather abide in virtue. Or if we have the fortune to meet someone who is in need, then with mindfulness and vigilance be aware of the arisal of miserliness and recognize this is an opportunity to benefit someone in need. This is a great opportunity to help another suffering being and embrace that opportunity help them. And likewise, when one is in a confronting situation, recognize that. Rely on your training in patience. Or if you're noticing that you're wasting time, you're wasting your days, look at for the presence of laziness and re-energize yourself with joyous perseverance. So all of this requires constant vigilance and reliance on vigilance with mindfulness.
That is Samsung Sudisha. That is that Samsung will be Gumsendi Songor in my Gumsenga Lamnada, Mai Dunga Chungi, Drapa Mai Bachena, Dujum Region Drapata, Simjim Mai de Jimmy Songs.
So the 19th verse then presented the way to guard the mind, and now the 20th verse presents a reason why it is imperative that we do so. So the 20th verse, if just being anxious about slight physical suffering leads me to be attentive and careful of a sore, due to fears of being destroyed by the mountains of the crushing hell, how can it be that I do not guard my scarred mind?
Mai Bachina, Jizada, Dinigi, Chigi, Miss Sansa, Dinner Trendy, Lula Mayu Hindi, Songa de Carjan Songorsene, Dinigi Madilla, two in the Dunga Yungo, Washere. Zida Dunga, Di Dunga Jidang, Dunga Dunga Chunju Chako, Dunga Shanda, two in the Dunga Chunju Washer. Dinigi Madilla, two Dunga Naza Dunga Yungo watch. Dini Dunga Chung, Dinichi Dunga Chungila, or Danga Dunga Yungo, the Deltuna Dunga Yungo recipe, Shana, Java Jeje. Madil Tumojoyachin and Dusum Gagor Hazirda. Dinega Wegi, Madi Subsub Chinpa, Bahab Chike Pasung Cheho, the Carresene, Madil Tusuna, Duma Naziligor, which is a Duma Giligor, which is Duma the Gugu Mari. She's a Duma Mugo Baza, Duma di Mioya, the Duma de Tariag Dandala, and the Madi Pasub Chin Gagor was. Ye May Dunga Chungi Jabang, May Bachinas.
So looking at the first two lines, if just being anxious about slight physical suffering leads me to be attentive and careful of a sore. So this is something we know from our own life. When we have a sensitive wound or sore, we're very careful of this. But what is the result that can come from it being aggravated? Nothing more than some physical pain. And most of the physical pain that we experience is of the class that is actually quite minor, but yet we are very careful. And that physical pain we experience, even when it is acute and intense, it's quick, it's not long lasting, it quickly passes. And of the various types of suffering, this is the coarsest form, the suffering of physical and mental pain. Yet, we take, incorrectly so, we are attentive and we are careful of our body when we recognize it as being sensitive.
Oda Nazidile Tarduki Nazudi Devameva Nazuli Dele Tarduki Samadin Din Suan in that didn't do I did Chunju Malia Tusi Nazidin Chunjun Shuruas in Danzuki Dujum Rijum Drabata and da Simgi Madi Jimmy Society down to Nyaviki Dunga Yawa Dujum Sada Yawa Sanya Sada Tanya La Sopata the Negi Idaki Joko Dunga Dingi Sana Dujum Sada Nyaviki Dusine. Dujum Dunga to get some tab in the bed. Deso and the Karachina Yung Karel Yungorasene, Chesang has the same Yomo, which was Dodge, same Yomo, Desha control and I get in it. Then it control us of a key and Digi and the Liang and Bassage, Mason Maki, Dunga, the bottom of a young wedding, Dunga Chembur was Mile to shoot Dunga Chebana dinner, Navy Dunga to get Dunga Bear, bottom of a Chembur is. Chesan Dinig Dunga deep, Dinig, Dunga did. Gain the Duan Bessafari, Sembigi, Shana, Yeche, Madi, and Simdi, Yomo Shoso, Carson Desu Chasan, Sim Yomo Balatinic, Semlatinic Yawade, Chisan Sim Yomo Chos Jedu, Din Yomo on Galeanga Passage, Dima, Nason, Likia, Daniel Likia, also Dunga, the Disney Yungore. Chisa Dunga, you, the nigger Dunga, the passage, Chica, Pautum, Dunga Chimpore. Chisa did Dunga, you. Same day, Yomo Chusum, Madawache, Sungo, the Kechimo Shur was, same day by the Jimmys in Jimmy Sungo, in Jimmy Sungo to answer.
So we certainly all want to be liberated from the kind of suffering that is described here, this physical suffering, even if we recognize that it is fleeting and it is, in the grand scheme of things, it is quite minor. We do want to be liberated from even the possibility of that suffering. But then when we compare to the suffering that our afflictions leads to, we recognize there really is no comparison. So this is the third and fourth line. Due to fears of being destroyed by the mountains of the crashing hell, how can it be that I do not guard my scarred mind? So this then calls to mind that from being under the influence of one's afflictions, minds such as anger, attachment, jealousy, pride, and so forth, they themselves accumulate karma, and when expressed through physical and verbal behavior, leads to the karma that can ripen into the suffering of the hells, with the rebirth in the hot hells, or the cold hells, or as a spirit, and so forth. And in this way, one ends up suffering in ways far beyond what can be experienced from even acute physical suffering. This needs to be recognized. This needs to be recognized and taken seriously, because it will give the impetus required to protect our mind, to safeguard our mind at all times.
세대에서 녀모버 기여도 컨트롤을 맞게 다 차발라 기리 디기 숙체주의 차배 원계 심장 소주 제발로서 받아. 근데 녀모 컨트롤 원계 신 소주 제발로서 받아. 되니게 기여 제여도 디기 레나 바사지 되니 여바치마 나솔 계획이 지게는 바동안 용어 받으면 바신 거래. 되네 동안 용어 찾아서 아주 셈 녀모 받을 때는 기기도 와서 되니 인자다 셈 녀모 받 아주 차상을 동안 구고 막 되네 강아들에 탈고 거래. 강아들 되바이 되고 막 시사 강아들 탈고 해서 먼저야 셈이 인지미지다 녀모 쇼스 마다와서 송국을 지미 송세대 가르치는 송국 말에 송국을 와서 보다 지미 송 인지미지 할전 송국 말 되네 강아들 위반은 강아들 인지미지 송국을 가르치는 송국 말에 인지미 송국을 해서 송국.
This verse is answering why it is so necessary to guard the mind, and it really comes down to this. The afflictions, for us, arise so easily. They really don't take much, and they arise. And with a minor cause, they can arise in a way that dominates our mind, destroys our happiness. And not only does it destroy our happiness there and then, but it can do so for a considerable time, destroying our mood, sending us into a downward spiral. But not only that, these afflictions then get expressed. They rise so easily, they can abide so long, and they tend to get expressed through our physical behavior and our speech. And in this way, we bring harm to those around us. So our afflictions don't only destroy our happiness here and now, but they can destroy the happiness of those around us. And we see the more extreme events in society where through anger, violence follows. And violence then becomes present in a household through verbal or physical violence, or in communities or between nations. And attachment too, though, leads to so much pain. It leads to taking advantage of others, stealing from others. It can lead to killing. And from this, we suffer in this life. Others around us suffer in this life. But then there's also the karmic causes that we are creating, which ensures that in lives to come, we will suffer more. We will suffer in ways far beyond what is even possible in this life. This needs to be recognized with vivid clarity, because none of us wants to suffer. We need to develop a deep and abiding aversion to the causes of our suffering, these very afflictions. And this aversion to the afflictions needs to be so deep and abiding that we recognize they can never be justified, they can never be tolerated, they are never acceptable. Therefore, at all times and in all circumstances, I must guard my mind from them, I must protect my mind from them.
nala de sumba di gimzen karasin ngarazo dunga dugyo mar chasa kanga gugo mar ngarazo digi gugo chasa kanga mogo baza kanga yonga de gyudi semnyo mobali ne yongo deni inza semnyo mobali de songo gores gimzen di roaso chasa da rang la jeba ne da rang shen da ngazo tyaba chimbe chue nyamlen chi che de rang de shen semje tamje da dunga midyo baza semje tamje 라젠 참아 동호회 유리 녀모바래 제가 녀모바들의 연구를 제가 랑야 녀모바들의 랑게 셈디야 녀모를 쳐서 맞다고 송고를 가서 소속에 디 녀모를 스타와네 디 제보 동화 연구를 마음바나 안 제가 동화 미디어 바래 동화들의 타고 보인자 네 랑게 셈디 녀모를 쳐서 맞다고 셈 개회 쳐서 샤진 셈 녀모를 쳐서 송고도 와서 김젠디레스 디나신 셰 셈제 있나요 라마의 셰 셈제니야 셈디 녀모를 쳐서 맞다고 셈 개회 쳐서 주야리야 아주 배수지역으로서 지가르선의 셈전 현다이나 동아 미디어바 셈전 차상 동아를 탈고바 인자 동아의 규리 녀모바에서 컨트 셈전 현다이 규리 녀모바 개발의 녀모바 디기인지데 동아 연구를 되네서 셈전 현다이네 셈 녀모바 쳐서 마다와 계획 쳐서 용투야게 아주 배수지역으로서 다 셈송고 김세로지 디제 디송고도와
What this really comes down to is each of us individually only want happiness and do not want to suffer. We have to make this point so clear to us that every single experience of suffering, both those which are manifest and obvious as well as the subtler forms, all come from the afflictions. We need to recognize this with vivid clarity so that we can have the strength of mind, the abiding determination to guard our mind from the afflictions. Then in addition to this, as people who aspire to enter into the paths of the Mahayana, to become Bodhisattvas, looking at this from the perspective of the Mahayana, we recognize that each and every sentient being also, just like me, wants to be happy, wants to abide free of suffering. And they, just like me, suffers from the same cause, the afflictions. So if to the extent I strive now in safeguarding my mind with mindfulness and vigilance from the afflictions, benefit will follow to others, and it will follow to them immediately, because not being afflicted in their presence, I'm not going to harm them. And I'll build up close and warm relationships with them, and making it far easier to be of benefit to them. That's the short-term benefit to others. And the long-term benefit is as I gain ever more skill in controlling my mind, taking care of my mind, preventing the rise of the afflictions, I progress towards the abandonment of my afflictions. I progress towards the attainment of freedom from suffering. And then I can be of real benefit to others. I can guide others whilst I am spiritually developing. I can guide others from a position of knowledge and experience in how to subdue their own mind, how to rely on mindfulness and vigilance themselves. So therefore, for the benefit of others, both right now and in lives to come, I need to take care of my mind.
지자다 김젠디네 자다 donda nimbo dela ngaju singa ju sem dela tine ngeo juya de ngaju sem dela tine jubo sem di na songye dongye semba songye semba syeba zunju ane samde shirap dame boto be shiradi ngaju samlo dige dene tone nyamle chebana sem gewe geo juya 지자다 di sem de sha khonro nyom bala so kebaina di sem dela tine dunhayoya inza ngaju sem di 녀모버스 기에디 파가 데네마 셈디 기위초르기디 같이 용토도 파셈디 데 단시신 denje 도시네 기위초르야 삼당고레 데니세바네 셈디 안에 나주게 셈송이 두죽세디 지고레스 제단디 제월 계침버레스 단단용 조디리도와 데니자 당으로베네 셴랴 잠바단 제위 삼바 공바이나 셈기 셈 안에 녀모베 초도 다의 가진 심 기회수 송고 지고와 진짜 심기 심송이 두juk 차고 그래서 셴리아 제와 셴리아 잠바 공바이나 셴리아 느베 삼바게 마로 콩리기 마로 데니게 데네 마기르 아니 셴라 뉴버스 네버지에게 송여도 아니 수림돼야 야고 송고로 되게 안직 신리야 제와다 젠바 송고도 안 신리야 팬비게 삼로 신리야 로제게 삼로 라슈기고 근데 슈켄데 리고로 되는 리도 동의선 바데 장용으로 제자다 신리야 네버 젠바다 지위 삼보 보면도 안 신리야 신기 파직 수네버 시베네 델리안 제외 삼바 젠바 파콘랑 말와 수베냠데 리고 제자다 아주게 셰리아 잠지기 냠내냐고 주바이나 나디 아니 디기 주의 셈안 셈송이 두슈티가 주 냠내 지거로 받아 제사 데디 게시와를 시송하디 데네샤거로 제사 나 인보디다가 돈다라 아주 셈디 뇽모베 슈소 마타와 게디네 셈디 게위철바 듀르투바 지오레스 디 잼비 게디나 셈 잼바 젠자 오딩에 게와티지 와 제고레스 뇽모베 디고 디지교 말 디지교 말 셈베 삼다 젠제 젠비 게디나 게와짱 젠고레스 아니 시신기 안 파제바 제제 지금 미국에 쳐다 뉴베 삼바다 되니 뇽모베리 지구디에미네 제바자 하고 있는 남사 어디 파 젠비 진제 셈 계획쇼도 당고레스 대다가지레 셈송에게 탑 셈송세디 디송제 지나 탑람디다 전시지 이게 된제 송고레스 너나님보디 디르도다
The very essence then of what we've looked at tonight is that it's imperative for each of us to take care of our mind. We do so through relying on vigilance and mindfulness to always ensure that our mind is not being overwhelmed by the afflictions, and if they are arising, they are not influencing us. And to do this, we rely still on mindfulness and vigilance to ensure that our mind stays virtuous. Therefore, we engage in training such as generosity, ethical restraint, patience, joyous perseverance, concentration, and wisdom. These, then, are where we should keep our mind. Whatever we are doing, we should have our mind on those virtuous topics. And to do so, we rely on mindfulness and vigilance. This is the very yogic discipline that we each need to embrace. We each need to live in accordance with this yogic discipline. And as aspirants for the parts of the Bodhisattva, it is by relying on mindfulness and vigilance that we'll develop the qualities that we will eventually become Bodhisattvas. Because to develop genuine minds of love towards all and minds of compassion towards all, we have to take care of our mind. Ensure it's not under the influence of the afflictions, but rather under the influence of wholesome qualities. And the training starts with the determination, I will not bring harm to others. The coarsest level is to ensure we do no physical harm. A more difficult level is to watch our speech. But for both of these to come about, we need to be taking care of our mind. So ideally, we ensure our mind is not expressing anything unethical or non-virtuous towards others. This requires mindfulness and vigilance. So by developing a wish not to harm others, we are developing an affectionate care towards others. We are recognizing their value. We do not want to add to their burden of suffering. Therefore, even thinking harshly about others, we will recognize that that is not acceptable. And then the trainings such as generosity become easier on the basis of ethics, where we develop the wish, I want to ease the suffering of others. Not only will I not harm them, but I want to ease their suffering. I want to bring benefit to their lives. So where I have an abundance, skills and talents and material abundance, I will utilize every opportunity that comes my way to ease the suffering of others. So in this way, we are developing, through mindfulness and vigilance, a determination to both not harm others because they matter to us, and to benefit them because they matter to us. This is the indispensable foundation to develop sincere love and compassion for others, which comes about through feeling connection with them, through feeling their worth, through having an open heart and a tender heart towards others. So then, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We can conclude there tonight. Thank you.